Hi class. Today we're going to be looking at formation of species and how we determine that we have a new species or organism. So, few key terms first. Speciation is the process of species formation. Morphology is internal and external appearance of an organism. So looking at what that organism actually, characteristics that organism actually has, physical appearance. Species are morphologically similar and can interbreed to produce fully fertile offspring. So that's the key part there. They're morphologically similar, which might include more organisms than actually fall into one species. But the fact that they can interbreed and they can produce fully fertile offspring makes them a species. They're from the same species if that is true. So, two competing concepts or ideas on how to determine that a species is actually a new species. Morph is based solely on appearance. Bio is based on who can reproduce with who successfully. Now, this process is not useful for animals that are already extinct or asexual organisms because those don't apply. So what do we use today? It is a mix of both. So we combine the morphology idea with the appearance and the biology portion, which is looking at their ability to reproduce. So a few terms to finish up this chapter. Geographic isolation is physical separation of members of a species. So an example here, river dries up into several small pools. The fish diverged enough to be considered separate species. So if you go back to our example of how evolution occurs, divergent evolution occurs when organisms started out from the same species but due to some type of environmental factor, which in this case would be isolation, they actually develop into two separate species. Now, it doesn't just have to be isolation, but in this case, that's what we're talking about. They're separated from each other. And they basically develop into two separate species. Now, the reason this happens is that now that they're in kind of a different location, they're isolated from each other, they will start to eat different things. They will reproduce at different times, possibly. Just their whole way of life will change. And once the way of life changes enough, they become a new species. So here's an example. Here's an example of reproductive isolation, which goes along with that. The species become genetically isolated, so the offspring of interbreeding species may die early or may not be fertile. And that just means that now they no longer, this original species that all lived together and had the same genetics, they were the same species, they were considered the same. They now, when they are back in contact with each other after isolation, can no longer produce fertile offspring. So here's our example. We have this set of fruit flies here that eats this maltose food. We have this set of fruit flies here that eats a starch food. Many generations pass, and they've been isolated based on their food source. After many generations, they're considered their own separate species. And when they're brought back together, they will mate with their own species. So notice this one ends up mating here. These reds mate here, and so on. So you notice that they are isolated from each other reproductively once they are brought back in contact with each other. They may have different mating times as well. Could be another example of that. So our rates of speciation, how do we get new species? Well, there's two thoughts on this. Gradualism says that speciation or development of new species occurs at regular gradual rates. Just over time, this just happens kind of at a regular pattern. Punctuated equilibrium says that there's a sudden rapid change in the environment or in a situation that causes kind of an explosion of new species, and then there's long periods of time where there's no change at all. We'll be looking at some of these in our notes, in worksheets as well in class. Okay, that's the end of chapter 16 notes. We will be doing a chapter 14 through 16 unit test, so it'll be a good idea to go back and review over all of those things as well.